Good morning, everybody. Actually, before I start, I should say that this is the Virgin voyage for our new microphone technology. So if it slips, it means that we have no experience in it, but so far it sounds good. So Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, good morning, everybody. It is indeed not only a great pleasure, but a great honor to have with us this morning the leader of the opposition in India as our guest this morning. And I think that the fact that I'm looking around now, that so many distinguished guests have come to IPI at this very early morning presentation is a testimony to the fact that there is a great interest in the functioning of the world's largest democracy. Mr. Jaitley is a distinguished lawyer and a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, I hope I pronounced it correctly, which is currently the principal opposition party in India. Before becoming the leader of the opposition, he held the position of Union Cabinet Minister for Commerce and Industry, Law and Justice in the National Democratic Alliance government from 1998 to 2004. And Mr. Jaitley, we are very much looking forward to your remarks regarding the upcoming elections taking place in India. I believe it's in April next year. But before I give you the floor, I would like to hand over to the former ambassador to India, Mr. Hardeep Puri, who is now a senior advisor at IPI. So Hardeep, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. Thank you for inviting our guest speaker today, and thank you for being here. Thank you very much. You know, all the work that the International Peace Institute does, prevention of conflict, conflict resolution, post-conflict reconstruction, all that at the end of the day is anchored in democracy. And no matter which way you look at it, this overall exercise that the UN undertakes is, in a sense, about how the democratic experiment works in some countries, falters in others, and results in fragile or failed states in yet another part of the world. And most of the Security Council's work today deals with situations where state structures have not been able to deliver, and there are conflicts, etc. And the overall effort is to try and restore democracy, either post-conflict or to prevent conflict from taking place. We are very fortunate to have Arun Jaitley with us because not only is he an eminent lawyer, he's also the face of the Bharatiya Janata Party, a very prominent leader, but he has spent many years working the Indian democratic experience. I am particularly happy that he's here because I have known him. I've had the privilege of knowing him for over 4 decades. I think close to 44, 45 years. And in that period, he has always been regarded as a very mature and sober analyst and advocate of political developments in India. We are also very fortunate to have with us a very large number of our colleagues, permanent representatives. I see the president of ECOSOC here, Nestor, the ambassador of Azerbaijan, Akshin, the ambassador of Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, Costa Rica, Canada, Cape Verde, Pakistan. I'm very happy to see Masood here, and so many others. I'm not going to name them, but I think all this testifies to an interest in Indian democracy. So may I just, on that, invite Arun to, the floor is entirely yours now.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to the IPI and giving me an opportunity to interact with such a distinguished audience here. I'm particularly encouraged by the fact that there is a lot of interest in the functioning of India's democracy, the largest democracy in the world. Many had doubts whether 6.5 decades ago, considering the levels of poverty, emerging discontent, when democratic regimes were being overthrown in various parts of the world, whether the system of democracy would survive in India. And the challenges were greater because there were challenges to sovereignty immediately after India's independence. We had a regulated economy, and our growth rates were very inadequate. And therefore, the satisfaction level with the quality of life was not very high. But yet, despite these challenges, despite diversities of various kinds, we did survive, and we survived well. Before I come to the current situation, which is certainly a larger subject matter of interest today, if I look back the last 6.5 decades, there are many areas of great satisfaction I have. We've institutionalized the system of free and fair elections. In fact, never has even a suggestion been made by anybody, be it opposition, be it even angry groups in India, that there is a slight possibility of an Indian election being unfair. In fact, so professional is the conduct of the Indian election that our election commission is invited globally as an observer, as a consultant in various governments. Our parliamentary democracy has emerged as probably the more suitable model. More suitable because we have different regions, and now there is a gradual shift in a national agenda. The first 2 to 3 decades after independence, I think one of the prime concerns was unity and sovereignty of the country. Today, in the last 20, 30 years, it's moved towards a greater amount of regional aspirations. So there is a larger emphasis on federalism, regional desires, as a result of which 2 factors which have emerged is that the institution of coalition governments in fact reflects that. Additionally, the aspirations of various regions converge into a decision-making process, which is the Indian Parliament. So you will even have parties with a single member of Parliament, which are part of the coalition government and are represented in Council of Ministers in alternative coalitions which have come into existence at the center. Now this different languages, different regional groups, different religious groups, different tribes, communities, different castes, which is a powerful structure in India, they all become a part of a decision-making process through a parliamentary process. In any other alternative system, probably this would be a little difficult. Federalism is becoming stronger by the day, not only because of the regional character of power distribution that we have and coalition governments, but also there are a huge amount, as I said, regional aspirations of the people, and therefore the growth of power centers in the regions also has taken place. This has actually helped to maintain India's unity with diversity itself. You have probably one of the most powerful judicial institutions. In fact, not only independent, but viciously independent. And at times, people feel that to one of our concepts called the separation of powers, there is some element of self-disciplining which institutions have to make, because even our judiciary, in curbing any kind of executive inaction or improper action, has been very prompt almost by the day. You have a very large middle class, probably one of the largest in the world. Now, along with this middle class, I think is emerging just adjacent to this, a very strong aspirational class. And these are people who are wanting to move up. They've come up the hard way, they've come from villages, they've come from remote areas, they're now aspiring. And this, with the expansion of the educational network, they smell opportunities. This itself is becoming one of our strengths. This has made the civil society reasonably powerful. If I can comfortably say that in Indian democracy, there is a spread of political power which is taking place. A government or a regime at the center can't say, I am all powerful. Power is today divided between the government, the parliament, the opposition, the regions, the civil society, the civil service, the judicial institution, the media, the public opinion. This spread of political power, in fact, itself keeps the checks and balances as far as the Indian system is concerned. Despite strong political differences and differences in ideologies, there is, in one sense, a convergence of a larger economic model. There would be differences with regard to the mode of implementation. But that convergence appears to be that India does need much higher growth rates. In fact, our satisfaction level at a national level is with a 9% plus growth rate in India. We all feel that the trickle-down effect of the growth will be there, but will be inadequate. And therefore, every government tries its own versions of the social sector schemes in order to fund who are the least privileged out of the whole lot. And that's how, in the last 23, 24 years, the system seems to be broadly functioning. Having said this, there are still many challenges which Indian democracy does face. And these are completely independent of the current political situation which exists today. I think one huge challenge is that there is a popular perception in India that the quality of politics in India needs to improve. Politics influences and impacts the life of the country. It influences all decision making. And therefore, a set of self-evolved changes are a little slow in coming about. Recently, we've had a spate of some judicially directed reforms to improve the quality of Indian politics, but the ones from within the political system are a little slow, and that at times leads to a sense of cynicism as far as public opinion is concerned. Poverty eradication has taken place. From a poverty figure of about 60%. We've come down to the mid-20s, but it's a little slow, and therefore it needs to itself be expedited. And there are regions where the impact of the entire growth process has not been felt at all. For instance, the most wanting regions in this are the tribal regions of central India. And the tribal regions of central India really become the deprived regions, as a result of which you have the huge insurgency called the Maoist problem emerging out of in those regions. Infrastructural improvements have taken place in the country, but the Northeast still seems to be deprived of that, the quality of infrastructure which must develop adequately. Of course, you have the problem of people below the poverty line. I've already made a comment on this. Terrorism is a very serious problem. Now, it could be insurgency, which could be even domestic. That is I referred to the Maoist problem in the heartland of central India. This is a very serious problem. The Prime Minister had, about 2 years ago, described it as the greatest challenge which India faces. And as a problem, Maoism is not a problem which is only relatable to the poverty or the inadequacy of development in those regions. Maoism is not a poverty eradication campaign. It's an attempt to violently overthrow India's parliamentary democracy and replace it by an ideological democracy of the ultra-left kind. And therefore, they use arms, they use all kinds of revolutionary tactics, they loot the ammunition as far as the police and the security agencies are concerned, and they are able to exploit the poverty of the region in order to fuel discontent. We are still struggling to find an answer to this because we've been looking for alternative answers in terms of do you simply go and pump money and resources and develop those regions? And that's one solution which is suggested. The other solution which is suggested is, do you follow a police-military approach to solve that problem? Now, the real truth lies somewhere in between. You can't build schools, you can't build roads, you can't build hospitals, you can't build other institutions in these areas, because if you spread landmines, obviously this developmental activity doesn't take place. In fact, existing establishments of this kind have been damaged by them. And therefore, you probably require a little, both actions at a war effort in terms of curbing this particular menace. Cross-border terrorism, India has been a prime target of it. We've lost literally thousands and thousands of people. There are also now domestic modules which have come into existence. And a lot of our resources, national resources, in both these, fighting both these forms of domestic insurgency and cross-border terrorism have been spent. In fact, Indian priority has always been to resolve issues even with our neighbors through a process of dialogue and negotiations. But then we've always felt that dialogue and terror can't coexist. And therefore, conditions conducive to that must be created, which have been somewhat wanting in this direction. In fact, one of our great desires is that the resources we are spending on all this are resources which we and our neighboring countries should really be spending as far as eradication of poverty and fighting the menace of hunger and underdevelopment in these regions is concerned. We'd like to settle our border disputes wherever they exist, particularly in the Northeast with China, through a dialogue process. Mechanisms have been set up, but they are awfully slow and creating a major issue as far as this is concerned. Where do we stand now in terms of, as far as domestic politics in India is concerned? This being the larger framework as far as the country is concerned, where do we stand today? We've had a government in power in the last 9.5 years, which has ruled India in an uninterrupted manner. It's called the UPA government. Today we are about 6 to 7 months away from the elections. And much that we normally follow a practice of not freely commenting on domestic politics when you travel outside, but the nature of the subject being such that some comment would be necessary. From all indications that I gather, there is a huge, it's more than what we expected, a huge anti-incumbency mood which has emerged in the country. In fact, it's unprecedented. It's almost resembles the mood which existed in 1977 or 1989 in India, when governments which had a comfortable majority lost by a large margin. And I do expect the results to be greatly influenced by this anti-incumbency mood. It's a mood where angry people are extremely keen to vote a government out and therefore are in search of alternatives. And in search of alternatives, they look for who has the option or the alternative to form an alternative government. Why has this anti-incumbency mood come into existence? Now, there are various reasons that I analyze for this anti-incumbency mood. I think after a long time, slowly it's happened in the last 2 or 3 elections, but this emerging elections, and that's a high point of Indian democracy, is all about governance issues. Maybe except in Andhra Pradesh, where the Telangana issue is going to dominate the outcome of the elections. In all other states and the rest of the country, the principal issues involved in the elections all move around governance issues. And therefore, this is one elections which is going to be formed, and that's in fact the emerging maturity of Indian democracy itself. And in governance issues, the first priority has been on the management or the mismanagement as far as the economy is concerned. From 1991 till 2004, I think we had 3 different colors of government in power. The reform process had continued. And from slower growth rates, we were moving towards a 6, 7, 8% growth rate. And I think the impetus of the reforms in those years made the tenure of the UPA one a little more comfortable. Last 3-4 years, we've nosedived from a 9% consistent growth rate, and now we are last year down to 5, and this year they are anticipating a 4 plus growth rate. And that's really impacting on a number of factors. I'll revert back to what I think went wrong as far as the economy is concerned. The second principal factor relates to corruption. In fact, the popular anger which has built up is because of huge number of corruption scams, and a large number of that have also adversely affected the management of the economy and India's ability to attract international and both domestic investment. There is some role for the security-related issues, both internal and external. And I think the fourth important factor is people see governance of the last few years as a major leadership failure. Now, in terms of these factors which have contributed to this angry anti-incumbency mood, if I just make a brief comment on some of these factors, as far as the economy is concerned, at least I seem to have learned a few lessons. And one of the principal lessons I've learned is that in the management of the economy, and that's a problem we've seen particularly in the last few years, the head of the government, the Prime Minister, must have the last word as far as the economic management of the country is concerned. Can I use this?
Of course.
Thank you. He has to be the natural leader of the country. He has to be the natural leader of his party. He has to have the last word. He has to have the ability to overrule others. And therefore, if he doesn't have all these rights, this authority, he's a prime minister who's in office but really not wielding authority. And therefore, this really has been the bane of the problems in the last few years. Creation of power centers outside the government, whether it's an advisory council but comprising of powerful people and whose command runs with the government and which becomes authority without responsibility, I think also contributed to this. Now, these factors reflected on the corruption issues, allocation of natural resources. Now, in a growing economy, you had to have a non-discretionary, non-discriminatory methodology of allocation of natural resources. So whether it was the spectrum for telecommunications, or it was the coal block allocation, or it's the iron ores. Now, the story of all these has been the same. And therefore, governments have run into difficulty. There have been severe indictments. You've had licenses being cancelled, investments being confiscated, leaders of the industry being investigated and prosecuted. Now, this has sent a huge negative signal to investors globally. Now, this started with these cases. It started with really two factors. One was the first factor that I mentioned, which converged into what's called the policy paralysis. It's a word which is now being occasionally used. Two, corruption-related issues resulted in a lack of confidence in the economy. As a result of which, not only was the international investor not looking at India, the domestic investors decided to look elsewhere. So it's a reverse flight also which took place. Retroactive taxation, investigative agencies being excessively used and misused, leading to a breakdown of relationship between government and opposition. Now, these are all factors which have contributed to this. So the first big point that I have to make is that there is a strong anti-incumbency mood, and therefore, whichever is the party in occupying the non-UPA space within its own state is going to be the natural beneficiary. And I have no hesitation in saying, since in a large number of states we occupy that space, obviously the advantage does come to us. The second factor, and these are all issues which are not emotive or which are not redundant, they're all relatable around the governance issues. The second factor, I think, which emerges out of a disillusionment with leadership, indecisiveness, lack of capacity to take decisions, I think is creating an environment where though we are a parliamentary democracy, the next election is almost becoming a quasi-referendum on leadership. Now, on leadership, there's a big question in India, and this is where Indian democracy is still maturing. There are two conflicting areas how leaders are created in India. And the two, you have a set of structured political parties which have their own structures, where there will be a series of, or a galaxy of leaders, and they choose the best out of them. We don't, unlike the United States, have a system of primaries, but in a structured political party, you'll have a set of leaders competing with each other, and the best will emerge. In fact, my party is the one which is closest to this experiment. We've been criticized as having taken a long time in selecting our leader, but the process we went through, though such a formal process doesn't exist in India, from amongst a large galaxy of leadership, we decided to choose who we thought was the most popular one. And it's a process which almost took us 2 to 3 years, but there was some semblance of a process by which it happened. Unlike the structured parties which exist in the case of my party, or even the left parties are a structured political party in India, you have parties centered around individuals or families, which don't have these structures. And the next in line is only the next descendant of the family. And these parties, if you see from the state of Kashmir to Jammu and Kashmir to Tamil Nadu, almost exist in every other state. They also exist at a national level. And therefore, the disadvantage in the dynastic parties is that to this very large middle class, to this large aspirational class, the whole idea of India becoming a dynastic democracy itself raises questions. It's happened in several decades in the past, but I'm not so sure this process can indefinitely continue. The other problem of a dynastic party is that the party becomes a crowd around a family. And the strength of the party is almost similar to the potential of the current generation of that dynasty. If he has an ability to deliver, then the party is stronger. If there is no ability to deliver, then the party itself becomes weak. And therefore, I foresee a situation where this election in a leadership referendum may also emerge as a strong ideological battle between a dynastic democracy or parties which believe in that kind of a structure, as against a more structured arrangement by which proven merit or proven ability comes into play in order to determine the leadership battle. So, in the backdrop of what I have said about the strengths and the challenges to Indian democracy, we are currently in a run-up to the elections where I think two broad points. It's the angry anti-incumbency mood, and it's the leadership potential which is going to dictate the outcome of the next elections. We are reasonably confident that we are going to be the front runners as far as the coming election is going to be concerned. But irrespective of what the results are, I can only conclude by saying that despite challenges which at times border even on crisis, Indian democracy has one great strength, and that's a strength of resilience, where India faces crisis after crisis, but we have a tendency and we have a whole history of emerging stronger out of each crisis. Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure some friends may want to interact, agree or disagree with what I've said.
Thank you so much for giving us a very comprehensive and I'd say penetrating analysis of the political landscape of India. Before I open the floor, since you are the leader of the opposition, and I believe that today's or yesterday's opinion poll shows that you will, if there were elections today, you will have not very far away from the double amount of votes that the ruling party has. So my question to you before I open the floor is, could you list the three most important issues that you would do differently and how from what the current government is doing?
I think the first big challenge that India faces is to restore the confidence as far as the Indian economy is concerned. For almost 2 decades, we've been able to showcase India's economy to the rest of the world. It's a great investment destination. And we've been able to increase India's economic activity. For the last 4 to 5 years, we've had this word policy paralysis, which I think was used in the political idiom of India for the first time, getting in. And I think the confidence in Indian economy has to be restored. Whatever steps domestically have to be taken. I think to restore that confidence, you need a change as far as India is concerned. The second, there's a very large disillusionment with regard to lack of probity in India. In fact, almost by the day, media headlines are on some areas where questions are being raised with regard to individual misdemeanors, governmental misdemeanors in terms of corruption. I think we need to completely change this lack of ethical space as far as Indian public life is concerned and restore confidence in the morality of governance as far as India is concerned, create strong mechanisms within the government itself. And three, I think in terms of foreign policy, the very large and major changes don't come about. I think there will be one important change, and that one important change is that we'd like, as a responsible nation, to resolve our issues with everybody, including our neighbors, through a dialogue process. But at the same time, a dialogue which doesn't result in elimination of the problems which are existence itself doesn't make itself may be inadequate, and therefore the environment of that dialogue will have to be created. For instance, I indicated in the course of my speech talk to you that an environment of terrorism, an environment of tension on the line of control, and an environment of dialogue can't coexist adequately in a country. And therefore, we'd like some kind of a response to that effect from our neighbors also, that we spend our energies and our resources as far as our own developmental activities are concerned, rather than on checkmating each other.
So thank you very much for that very concise and to the point expose of what you would do if you get into power after the elections in April. May I now open the floor for questions and remarks? I can see a hand at the very back there. Can you please state your name and your affiliation when you take the floor? You have the floor.
My name is Rob Jenkins. I teach political science at Hunter College. Thank you for your presentation.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. Rob Jenkins, Hunter College. My question has to do with the leadership selection process that you referred to in your talk, and the BJP having a long but ultimately successful process in selecting a prime ministerial candidate. You were quoted in the press earlier this year, widely reported, in a speech apparently that you'd given to a party meeting, saying that the BJP should be selecting a candidate who has wide appeal and can appeal to other parties, much as the prior BJP prime minister did. Now, I'm wondering, without naming any names, that was apparently your position. Now, more recently, we have Mr. Modi identified. I'm wondering whether you think he will be the person to be able to draw in the allies required to reach the 272 number, because the polls referred to by our moderator, of course, don't bring you to that point. And if he is, which parties would be likely to join in this government? Because, of course, we know that certain parties have claimed that they didn't want to join hands with the BJP under these circumstances. So which parties do you think would be a possibility? And in that context, once the BJP were to take office, would you take actions to repeal acts of government passed by the current administration that you've been critical of, such as the NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act? I know you've had criticisms of it. A lot of people do, for good reason, but would you repeal it or would you leave it in place? So how to attract allies and what to do about programs, particularly NREGA, if the BJP takes power?
Thank you very much. My intention was actually to collect a few questions, but since this question contains so many questions, I think I will give you the floor directly.
Well, I won't reveal the entire electoral strategy of the BJP here, but I can tell you the basic change which is taking place in this election. Ordinarily, we go by a conventional logic in an election and we count the likely tally in every region in India, every state in India. And when we start counting numbers, we consider the national election to be a net aggregate of various state polls. That's been the conventional methodology of calculating. I can assure you that this election is not about arithmetic. There's a huge change in the chemistry as far as the ground realities are concerned. And the kind of responses that we've been getting, Mr. Modi has been getting in areas where we haven't been strong conventionally is also unprecedented. There are several parts of the country in North India, Central India, West India, where we are very strong, and therefore our strike rate in these regions is going to be very high, in fact, unprecedentedly high. As far as the other regions are concerned, where we've been relatively weaker, there is going to be a quantum jump as far as our vote is concerned. And therefore, once there is a quantum jump as far as the vote is concerned, I don't think we can be ignored in those regions. Ignored either in terms of winning seats or even ignored in terms of local alliances which will come up. Now, this question, which is again asked on basis of that conventional arithmetic, who are going to be your allies in the current situation that that as the election proceeds? If the BJP is weak, we probably won't have many allies. If the BJP is strong, we'll have many more allies, some before the elections and some after the elections. Now, as far as your question on schemes like Manrega is concerned, you see, these are hypothetical situations when you come into government, how you deal with the actions which have been taken by previous governments. After all, statecraft requires a certain amount of continuity has to be maintained, some changes have to be maintained. But since you did give a particular example, let me tell you, I see nothing wrong, and that's why I consciously used the word that there could be differences in the implementation of the programs, but on a larger perspective that India needs larger growth rates and utilize that enrichment of the state emerging out of the growth rate for various poverty alleviation schemes. So principally, I think most political parties would follow that model. We certainly would follow that model. But even in the poverty alleviation schemes, even when you go out with a scheme, the intention need not be only to enrich your own votes through these schemes. I don't think, I think Manrega should have been implemented in a manner in which it could also result in some asset creation. And one of the changes which are required, or the improvements which are required to Manrega, is to link it to an element of asset creation, which so far has not adequately taken place.
Thank you very much. I saw a couple of other hands. Warren, you don't need any introduction.
Is it working? Yep, sorry. Warren Hogue of IPI. Mr. Jaitley, India, of course, is a charter member of the BRICS. And my question is, how does that influence Indian foreign policy? How would it if you were the leader? And are there opportunities for collaboration and cooperation with the other countries in the BRICS that you would take and you would exploit to better project Indian influence in the world?
Shall we take one more question before I give you the floor again, Mr. Jaitley? I can see you at the back there.
Thank you. Ishan Tharoor, Time Magazine.
I think you have to speak up a little bit.
Ishan Tharoor, Time Magazine. You spoke initially in your presentation on the rising federalism in India, the increasing regionalization of politics.
A little clear, please.
You spoke sorry, is this working? You spoke of the increasing regionalization of Indian politics in the beginning of your talk. Is there a point at which current trends may make politics in the center unmanageable? Is there a point when the rising influence of these regional parties sort of threatens the ability of Parliament to properly safeguard the national interest?
I think you have to do something with the microphone.
Were you able to understand?
I'm sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now? I'm sorry about that. All I was asking
Actually,
was...
not your fault. There's something wrong with the mic.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay.
Much
better. Okay. Hi. So all I was asking was, is there a point at which the current trends of regionalization that we're seeing, the rising influence of certain regional parties, makes politics unmanageable in the center? And how does Parliament, in its current form, safeguard the national interest given the influence of these parties?
Actually, before I give you the floor to answer those two questions, I should mention that this is the son of Shri Tharoor, who's a friend of all of us here, and also serving as a minister in India. Thank you. He was at the board of IPI, and we are also together at the board of another organization. So give your father my best regards. I will be in India in 2 weeks and see him. Sir, you have the floor.
Well, I don't see any change as far as the India is a part of the BRICS which is going to take place, irrespective of any changes in government which may take place. I think the bigger challenge is not that there will be any changes or in approach. Today, the biggest challenge is that how do we take this 4% back to 9% in India in terms of our growth rate so that the eye in the BRICS doesn't fall off. Because that seems to be the whole basis of BRICS was that these were the great emerging economies in the world, and therefore they were going to have an impact. But if we don't pull up our socks and go back to the original levels where we were 4 years ago, that's going to be a more serious challenge. You see, when you asked about the regional forces making India's governance unmanageable, I think a defining moment is the early 90s, which brought about a change in India, that the age of tall majorities for a government in power or a single party government in power got over, at least for the time being. And therefore, from the Congress party's principal position, where it used to get 300 and even 400 seats in parliament, I think if you see the range of the last 4 elections, it's been between 112 to 200 odd seats, when 272 is the halfway mark. I think there is one important factor to be borne in mind in all this. The regional parties are a reality today. The regional parties can't be wished away. In fact, in a diverse character of India, where you have different regions, and I mentioned in the course of my original presentation that particularly in the last 2 to 3 decades, regional aspirations have come to the force. And in fact, they've become one of the prime subjects as far as the center stage agenda of India is concerned. So federalism is important. It gets reflected in these regional powers emerging and then being a part of a national coalition. Now, this being a reality, I don't think this should be considered now a problem. Governments in India must have the large-heartedness to deal with these regional groups and adopt them as a part of the power structure itself. When the NDA government was in power, we broadly didn't have a problem with any of the regional allies. They had important portfolios, they were responsible partners, and we were willing to, my party more than anybody else has realized this reality. Today, I emphasize on federalism, knowing fully well that in our previous incarnation, the Janasangh, we accepted the unitary character more than the federal character of India, because we've seen this change and we've adopted as far as this change is concerned. And therefore, we must live with this change. The only caveat that I want to add is that for a national coalition, to have 272 or 300 or 350 seats in the center, the anchor of the coalition has to be a major national party. Therefore, the anchor must be somebody who has a reasonably large strength. That's only how the coalition can be balanced. Now, if the anchor itself is a party of 20 or 30 seats, it can't balance a coalition. And that's what's always made the third front a failed idea. So just a combination of regional groups itself won't survive, because that's a group without an anchor, and that government won't be a lasting government. We've tried it a couple of times, and that experiment has collapsed. It's never worked, and it's never going to work. So the anchor of a national coalition is either going to be the BJP or the Congress, and probably not any of the smaller groups itself.
Thank you once again. I saw 2 hands here, also a close friend of IPI, so we will start over there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. I
Maybe you
almost
should
said Prime
state
Minister.
your name and your affiliation.
Yeah, Sol Weisletter, DPR of Costa Rica. One of the conclusions today in Latin America is that after the growth that we've had in economic terms in the last decade a little bit more, is that inequality has grown also very much. And that is posing also a problem of governance for many countries. I think that also might happen in other parts of the world, but I think it's very clear in Latin America. So I would like to know if you have any thoughts about policies that not just try to improve growth, economic growth, but also redistribution in favor of lower income people. And the second question, which is maybe is, when you, I don't know, I know almost nothing about the Indian political system, but you've been talking about the problem of the regional parties, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that that may, in the future, make it evolve to a presidential system whereby you would elect a president and then you wouldn't have to go through coalitions in terms of regional parties, et cetera? Thank you.
Very interesting question. Shall we take one more before I again give you the floor? You have the floor, sir.
Good morning. My name is Rahul Soor. I work for the UN, but I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I just wanted to draw your
Can you
attention.
move the mic a little bit
Yes,
closer to you?
I wanted to draw your attention to Mahatma Gandhi's statement that cleanliness is next to godliness. And the reason why I say this is that if you have a look at Indian history, the fact that we have a very long tradition of town planning, in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and even in, Emperor Ashoka, when he was planning lots of urban works, looking at the condition of Indian cities today, some of them are privileged, like Chandigarh, like Delhi. There is, I think, a lot of improvement to be had in the physical characteristics of Indian cities, in planning, in cleanliness. So as a party which is, has an all-India vision, would you like to think about committing yourself to, improving the physical infrastructure, a drive of cleanliness, which is something which strikes a visitor, even as an Indian? And I'd just like your views on that. Thank you.
One or two more questions, and then one or two more questions.
Yeah, I see another hand. So because time is running out, so I think we will take two more questions and then we will round off.
This is Rahul Mukherjee from the National University of Singapore. I teach South Asian Studies. My first question is the following. Clearly, economic reforms began with the Congress Party, and then with some hesitation, it was revved up by the Bharatiya Janata Party. And that obviously contributed to the growth rates that we have seen during the Congress regime. But one of the reasons why the BJP probably lost once and then twice was what later on got termed as India Shining. And what really appealed, I think, to the Congress Party, or one of the chinks in the BJP's armor, was probably growth, but what people saw as kind of a faceless growth. And then you have the right to education, you have the right to employment, and you have the right to food now. So you could argue that the government has become fiscally irresponsible. Also the right to information, which has created so many problems within the government that there have been attempts to revise it and make it more conservative. Now clearly, in this chaotic milieu, something is happening. Growth and welfare are happening. It doesn't matter who comes to power. The BJP finds out what the problems of the past are, the Congress Party finds out what the problems of the past are, but as the BJP reminisces the Congress past, what kind of correction would it do to welfare and a kind of democratization? And in fact, a lot of people would argue that the right to information has really slowed down government. On the other hand, we also know that the right to information is a very powerful tool in the hands of people to expose corruption. How do you feel would a new government face these dilemmas? I think this is one, you can give a kind of a bipartisan answer. And the second question, a brief one, is in the absence of a leader like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, whom I think a lot of people respected on both sides, what kinds of challenges do you think that the BJP will face in coalition management? This goes beyond the answer that you've given, which is that victory is good enough.
Thank you very much. And then, in brief, one more question. Go ahead, sir. And I emphasize in brief because time is running out.
Hi, this is Shuman Mazumdar from India Abroad newspaper. Mr. Jaitley, I have one question. You talked about how to increase the growth rate, the GDP, but a large number of your, major part of your speech is devoted on to that, the GDP. My question is, recently, as you are aware, there are kind of conflicting views between two economists of repute, with one approach being that you first need to raise your GDP growth and then all other things will follow. While an equally celebrated economist is talking about you need to invest on infrastructure, education, health, etc., and this will be followed by growth. So in case your party is coming to power, what's the approach you think you're going to take? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is yours again.
See, as far as the rising inequalities are concerned, it's a major challenge. I don't think it's a challenge which can be corrected overnight. Therefore, you will need to spend a very large part of your national resource on various social sector schemes. So even though you go up for higher growth rates, governments will have to have a social consciousness. Now, how you implement it, these schemes, whether they are only going to be a vote gathering mechanism or are they going to be very seriously implemented in these areas, I think there can be a difference of approach. But in the last 2 decades, successive governments have tried that model itself with its own variations. In fact, a comment came with regard to right to food, etc. Let me just clarify. You may legislatively create it now, but at the same time, the whole idea of the right to food, because of a very large below poverty line population, was born in Chhattisgarh, one of the BJP governed states. And the best model in India is in some of the NDA BJP states as far as the distribution of subsidized food to the poorer people is concerned, and it's being implemented for the last 5 to 7 years. Let me tell you, when you mention that when you statutorily incorporate a right to employment or a right to food or a right to education, are these becoming effectively enforceable rights? We still have to travel a lot of distance. It's not yet been tested. On food, I worked out the figures. It's only a reformulation of all existing schemes. So the amount being spent is what was being spent before the legislation. The quantums remain the same. There are some segments where it actually goes down. The below poverty line are going to receive a little less. A below poverty line family was originally receiving, let's say, 35 kilograms of food grain every month. Now each member gets 5 kilograms. So if you're a family of 4, you get 20 instead of 35. So the quantums are going to go down. And therefore, the number of people who are benefiting actually comes down by about 10 million, a crore of people. Therefore, to say that merely because you've legislated, it becomes in any way a better right itself doesn't make much of an impact itself. I think urban infrastructural improvements with emphasis on hygiene, cleanliness, sanitation, these are huge challenges India has to face. Now, all these challenges ultimately reflect in what are the resources of the state going to be in going to support this. And you go back to the same basic formulation that India will need much higher growth rates. You must pursue that path. At the same time, how do you use that resource? And you will have to prioritize your user of those resources itself. And therefore, to say that whether you use it for improvement of urban centers in the first instance or you use it for poverty eradication schemes is all a matter which you probably have to consider. When you said where would you prioritize it in terms of expending the resources, I indicated in my opening comment the 2 areas of priority I see the maximum. I think the resource has to be pumped in the first instance into our tribal areas and infrastructural creation in the Northeast. We have to admit that geographically these are the 2 most ignored sections as far as the Indian state is concerned, and the priority of resources will have to be fed into these two segments itself. Now, in terms of whether it's infrastructure or it's health, one is not going to be a substitute for the other. You see, you'll have to proceed on a pattern, because if you have health schemes which have come up in various states, Infrastructure, in fact, at some stage in the economy, had picked up at a great pace. It slowed down in the last few years. And I think you'll have to restore back your rural roads, your national highways, the railways is not in the best of health, and therefore these will have to be expedited. As far as health is concerned, there is a challenge. There are some schemes which have come up in the last few years, even centrally funded scheme in the states for ambulances and some subsidized medications, etc. But the creation of governmental facilities across the country, or public health facilities across the country, has come down in the last 10 years. It's not being done. And therefore, costly private health facilities are expanding. But public health facilities have slowed down. And I think that's one area we can't afford to ignore at all. Because the private health facility for an average Indian is still unaffordable.
Actually, I think I have to close now because time is really running out, and I want to do it also in respect to our guest here this morning. Mr. Jaitley, it's been really a privilege having you and listening to your candid and penetrating analysis of and drilling so deep into the key issues which is facing your country. And of course, it's been a particular pleasure, an honor to have you here because you are not only a brilliant analyst of affairs of India, India, of course, which is not only the largest democracy in the world, but will soon be the largest country in the world in population. It's been a particular privilege since you are not only a brilliant analyst, you might also, in 6 months from now, be maybe the leader, or at least one of the top leaders of your country. Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege.